Thank you very much, Sarah. So, as Sarah said, I'm working with her on this EU project. And just to make sure that the audience is clear, I'm a psychologist. I know very little about mining. I know what I know is mainly from Sarah. And just to introduce the topic of my talk, I'd like to start off with some data, because what I'm really interested in is the reputation of the sector of mining. And if you look at data and you compare the mining sector with a whole range of different sectors, you can see that mining is not doing so well. In fact, mining is down when you look at how consumers rate it in terms of social responsibility, is down there with tobacco industry, with the alcohol industry, and it's even doing worse than the oil and petroleum industry. So I like the topic of this conference, critical choices, because I think as a sector, the mining sector has to think about why are they doing so poorly when it comes down to their reputation on social responsibility. And make no mistake, I looked at the data from 2013, 10 years before this data was released. It was exactly at the same level. Nothing has changed. So the reason I want to give this talk, the reason I'm here, is because I'm interested to think about why is mining down that list so low, and how might we think differently as a sector on these reasons. So one of these reasons, and Jeff already mentioned this, he called it the difference between inside and outside, can actually be found in the RMM report 2020, who had a list of key findings where they compared sectors on different dimensions. And one of their the first key finding is that there's a significant gap between what the sector is doing and what society expects from them. And that's exactly where I think we have to start thinking as a sector on where might we improve and how can this be fixed. So there's a gap between society expectations and the performances in the sector. If you think about these discrepancies, then I think we have to think about mining not from a responsible point of view, but we actually have to start thinking as mining from an ethical perspective. And an ethical perspective is different from responsibility because it focuses on actually what is seen as the right or wrong thing to do. So this is something, and this was actually also in one of the flyers of the conference. This is in the eye of the beholder. This is not something that the sector can define for themselves. This is not something that is said in laws or governance or regulations. What is right or wrong, what is ethical, is actually in everyone's mind. So if you look at sort of the definitions, business ethics, so from a business perspective, ethics usually refer to standards for morally right or wrong conduct. But that's taking the view of a sector, a business. If you look at a consumer's point of view, if you look at the general public, then you might think about the perceived business ethics. So how does a consumer, how does someone of the general public think about these business practices, and to what extent do they believe this is morally acceptable? To what extent do they think this is actually the right thing to do or not? And this is exactly where Jeff was talking about the inside versus the outside. There is a huge discrepancy between what the business is thinking is ethical and what they're doing, and how this is actually perceived by anyone else outside of the sector. And this is where Benjamin Sovacool has labeled this as an ethical conundrum. So he is, and this is a quote from a paper from 2020, he is saying, okay, the mineral and metal supplies are geologically determined, but socially mediated. So this discrepancy is key to start thinking about the reputation of the sector. Now back to this fantastic project that Sarah and I work on. It's called Vector. I just thought I'd throw it in here. Have a look at our website if you're interested. We're trying to look at the different social and geological challenges to access critical raw materials in Europe. And I'm particularly involved in this part of the project where we look at the societal challenges around this. And I'm very willing to share some data, fresh data that we found on these ethical components. So as part of this Vector project, we are actually looking at an argument that's often given in the mining sector. So we actually do very important work because we help to supply the green transition. There's a huge increase of demand of critical raw materials, and we're supplying that. So we are essential sector. We are really important. And that's all true. But the question is, from the perspective of a consumer and the general public, does that mean that there's actually a more morally acceptable business case going on? And so we did a survey. I'm based in Ireland, as Sarah said, and we did a survey. It was ran under 80, hang on. It was run under 81 people, representative sample from Ireland. It was a pilot study, but actually it already revealed some very interesting data. So we asked people, we explained to them that in the green transition, we do need more raw materials. And we asked them for 5 different sectors, whether they thought these sectors, when thinking about their role in the decarbonization of Europe, how ethical and unethical they were. And again, as confirmed before, the mining sector was rated as the lowest ethical sector across this range of sectors. So then the question is, why is this? Why is the mining sector so far down below all other sectors? And one way we started thinking is to think about what is the level of trust in the mining sector. And if you think about trust from in the literature, trust refers to the extent to which people are willing to rely on someone else or on some other industry. So to what extent are you willing to rely on the mining sector is really the question here. And we believe that this might influence the level of the ethical perceptions of the mining sector. Now, the willingness to which we're willing to rely on the mining sector is not just a generic sense of trust, but trust depends on different dimensions. So you can talk about the competence of a sector, which is the extent to which an organization is capable, effective, skillful. So to what extent do we trust a sector is competent in doing what they're doing? There is trust in the dimension of integrity. To what extent is an organization showing integrity? Are they sincere? Do they tell the truth? Do they fulfill promises? And there's a dimension of trust called benevolence. And benevolence refers to what extent is an organization caring about the welfare of others? To what extent do they act in the interest of society? And the best way to think about this is when you think about, is there a secret or hidden agenda from that company? And if that's the case, then usually benevolence is felt to be quite low. So what we were interested to see is, do these different dimensions of trust influence the extent to which the ordinary public believes that the mining sector is ethical or not? So as part of that survey study, we measured these different dimensions of trust, and we regressed that on the perceived ethics of the mining sector. So first of all, what we saw was that integrity was the highest predictor of the perceived ethics of the mining sector. We also see that the more benevolent or the less benevolent the organization was, the less ethical the mining sector was seen. But finally, and I think very interestingly, competence, the trusting competence, did not predict how ethical the mining sector was seen. Now, this is where I think there's a key message to be found, because a lot of messaging, a lot of communication, a lot of PR is actually focusing on competence. We are good at our jobs. We do, we do comply with guidelines. We're skillful, we're effective, we're professional. But that is not the key reason why the sector isn't seen as ethical. It is much more to do with integrity. It's much more to do with benevolence. So, to finish this one off, I really like the topic of this conference, critical choices, because I think as a sector and as a sector as a whole, is really important to start making critical choices. And critical choices to focus on, okay, how can we increase trust in order to be seen as a more ethical sector, and get away from the area of tobacco and alcohol and oil and gas companies. And I think when you think about these things, is we just heard Louis talking bribery and corruption. This is directly linked to integrity. We've got to work on that. We've got to think about this PR issue and this reputation issue. And in my mind, it's much more about being convinced by the general public where we're doing things wrong, instead of trying to convince the public that we're doing responsible work, because there's a real tension between them. I'll finish there. Thank you very much. There is my email address if you want to see it. I'll hand over back to you, Sarah.
Fantastic. Thank you so, so much, Geertje. Round of applause, everybody, for the amazing Geertje, and just a fantastic talk that you've just given there.